Very good. Well, we had two fantastic sessions this morning, and we're going to have two fantastic sessions this afternoon. So I've done my job, which is to get you all to come and sit down, and I'm going to hand straight over to Stephanie to introduce her fantastic panel. Stephanie.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mark, for having me. I've been given the honor of chairing this panel. My name is Stephanie. I'm a clinician scientist and surgical trainee by background. In the last 5 years, I've worked with over 50 deep tech and AI startups as part of a health tech consultancy, a leading health tech consultancy, at the intersection of product, regulatory, and go-to-market strategy. My main interest in AI is clinical validation and impact. How are you going to prove that what you are building does what it says on the tin? Because at the end of the day, patient outcomes is all we all care about, and a return on investment might. But anyway, I was walking over and I saw the Dyson building. I didn't know there was a Dyson building here, and I remembered a podcast. I love podcasts, and I listen to podcasts on three things mainly: healthcare, tech, and money. Not all together, they're usually separate. And one of my favorite podcasts is Guy Raz's How I Built It. And my favorite one to date is James Dyson talking about how he built his company, from mortgaging his house age 40 to Dyson as we know it today. My other favorite one is Sam Altman of GPT-4, OpenAI. It's actually a podcast that was recorded in 2017 that I only listened to 6 months ago, before everyone, including my mother, finally knows what AI is. And he talked about ChatGPT and how he felt that the power of AI could change everyone's lives. And so he felt that what they were aspiring to build, he knew would change life and work as we know it for everyone. He knew that it would make a huge impact. And most importantly, he felt that it should be free. The impact of AI should be free. And so they set out to build what is now ChatGPT-4 and the most advanced AI system in the world, except that whilst they built a charitable non-for-profit organization at the start, they soon realized that the resources they needed to build an AI powerful enough to have the impact and effect on our lives, that they would need a lot of money. And so they went to the government, the American government, and said, can we have some money? And this isn't quite Innovate UK. And the government said, no, you can't. And so they went to private investors. So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves as they start to talk about their work in AI, their vision of the future. But firstly, I want to say that it's a huge pleasure to have this panel. I know Will and Sarah because we work together. Will, I've done due diligence for in big Series A AI deals. Sarah and I have worked together on a non-professional level in her work in breast cancer AI. Darzi is a hero of mine. If you've been a surgical trainee in the NHS, you know that to be a Darzi fellow is coveted, and it's something that we all kind of looked up to, and I've looked up to him for most of my career. And Alison is a new acquaintance, and it's a pleasure to talk about clinical trials, which is a big passion of mine because I did cancer research. So I'm going to start with Will, and Will's going to introduce himself. And he's going to answer the first question, and then I will go along the panels, and our panelists will introduce themselves as they talk. And the reason I'm starting with Will is that it all starts with where the money goes. My brother is in finance. He always said to me, Stephanie, the science only matters if the business makes sense, which deeply upset me as a passionate NHS doctor. And as I've spent the last 5 years working with investors and AI companies, still with the passion and dedication of an NHS doctor, and still with this belief that we can continue to innovate and change healthcare and improve healthcare outcomes, I now very much understand that it all starts with where the money goes. And so, Will, I would love for you to start by introducing yourself and talking about your work and how you've invested in AI companies, but mostly to tell us a bit about what you think is mission critical, given that there are only finite resources in the world.
So thank you very much for having me. So I'm I lead the health strategy at Octopus Ventures. So there's 6 of us in the team, a mixture of clinicians, academics, commercial folks. And over the last probably 3 or 4 years, we've invested in about 30 early stage health businesses. So I have the privilege of working with teams focused on businesses like Quit Genius in substance use disorder, Skin and Me in dermatology, LGBT sexual health businesses like Lavender. But I also led our investment and sit on the board of Ibex, which is a computer vision AI business focused on digital pathology. So they've achieved a 99.99% positive predictive value for identifying prostate cancer in H&E stain slides, which is an industry first. But as a team, we've also invested in lots of other AI businesses outside of health. I think one of our biggest successes, but kind of bittersweet, was investing in a small Cambridge-based business called Evie, which was then bought by Amazon and then became Alexa. That's now a 400 million a year revenue line, which we clearly sold too early. But we were also an investor in Magic Pony, which was a video compression business using AI, which we sold to Twitter. We're also an investor in SwiftKey, which we sold to Microsoft, which was the predictive keyboard. And actually quite exciting. I don't think we've fully even started to understand the impact of GPT and generative AI and what it means, both from a opportunity side, but also from a risk perspective. But as a team, especially when we're investing in more like health infrastructure businesses, like Ori, which is a cell and gene therapy manufacturing platform, or Overture, which does robotic IVF and egg vitrification. Like, we're very excited by infrastructure businesses, but the challenge there when investing in those types of businesses, where arguably the size of the prize and the potential is at its largest, is that you're often investing and working with teams who have an incredible technology, but they haven't quite figured out how to turn that into a product, and they haven't even really figured out where the right set of stakeholders or where the right problem is to aim that product. And so we spend a lot of time working with our founders to understand how you productize and then find where the most acute and important applications of these technologies are. And in many ways, the experience with Ibex fits that mold exactly. And so when we first invested, was the team are incredibly technical, like very sophisticated team. Most of them are ex-Israeli Special Forces, which has a certain flavour to conversations. But this was a very, very sophisticated team, but looking at how they could apply their incredibly sophisticated computer vision algorithms to drive end patient outcomes. And so we've been through quite an interesting journey with that business of, is this an opportunity where this is about increasing or decreasing risk and quality assurance of digital pathologist views and outcomes? Or is this a business where we should package up the underlying technology and sell it as a efficiency gain, where some of the largest private pathology groups in Europe actually find that very interesting? Or do we actually aim the technology more towards a biopharma route and look to replace liquid biopsies as a way of understanding patient eligibility? And so taking market share from people like Oncotype, who I think make about 350 million a year, in understanding which patients should be eligible for oncology drugs. And so there's lots of different ways of positioning and packaging up the AI to work out which set of stakeholders are going to most acutely benefit from that technology, which has been an exciting journey to be part of, but a very frustrating one in acknowledging that actually often the best AI and the best technologists will not ultimately build the best businesses, and trying to work out what the right application and sequencing is really critical.
Thanks, Will. I think that moves us nicely on to Sarah, and I'll leave Sarah to introduce herself, but I think my main question for Sarah, given what she does, is once you've built an AI software that can do what it says it will do, it meets its intended use. We have clinically validated that this software can diagnose to a high accuracy prostate cancer in microscopic slides. How do you get it to patients? How do you implement mission critical, because we know that cancer diagnostics, for example, is a mission critical, high priority area. How do you then implement it into the healthcare system? Sarah.
$1 million question. So I'm Sarah Kerruish. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at a company called Kheiron Medical. We're based in the UK, and we've built a technology called MIA that reads mammograms in the context of breast screening. It makes the same determination as a radiologist, should I call this woman back for further assessment or not. And it's highly accurate. We've now deployed clinically in Hungary, where it's picking up 13% extra breast cancers. And for context, breast cancer is a very difficult cancer to diagnose. It requires 2 radiographers in the UK and in other leading breast cancer programs. And 20% of cancers are missed in routine screening. So MIA is proving to pick up 13% of extra cancers in Hungary, which was just reported on the front page of the New York Times. So we know we have technology that works. Your question, though, is really how do we get it into clinical practice more broadly? And it's a long path, and there are really some really critical steps. I think for us it starts with, obviously, to your point, well, you need to build a model that's meaningful, solving a meaningful problem. You need to figure out the value proposition, the product, the workflow, where does it fit in the workflow? All of those things are perilous. But if you do get to that point, I think there are some really key obstacles that everyone needs to be mindful. But I just actually want to take a step back and say that I think one of the other really critical things before you even get to deployment is, does the AI generalize? Does it work for every woman in the UK, for example, or every woman in the world? And that is a painstaking and methodical process. So we've worked with leading academic institutions all over the world to make sure that the data is representative of many ethnic groups. And again, there's no getting around that. You just have to do that work. It does take time. You have to build products from the beginning that really solve for that issue of inclusivity. And once you've done that, I think then you have to start assessing, does your technology generalize? Not does it just work in an academic institution where you have a data set, and it's not that difficult actually to solve that problem, but to actually take an algorithm or an AI solution and make it work in the wild, in the woolly world of healthcare where all the data's a mess, everybody knows that. Is really, really difficult, but it starts with the inclusivity. It starts with starting to prove generalizability, making sure that you're assessing the AI not just on retrospective trials of data you've seen, but you're putting it in the wild. We, for example, did that in Aberdeen and on the west coast of America to make sure that MIA was working there on unseen populations. And then what we continue to do is we've developed a deployment methodology, and I think this is really key because ultimately it's about real-world evidence, and you have to be able to prove at that site that the technology works. And fortunately with AI, there's some really easy ways to do that. So for example, MIA shadow reads for a period of time to make sure that the performance is what we think is acceptable and the clinicians think are acceptable. So that is key. And I think if you are assessing an AI solution, in terms of evidence, I think it's also really important that we skill people to understand how to look at that evidence. For example, a lot of people, when they do these trials, they'll doctor their data. They will have representative data, but it's not truly representative. They'll have the right number of positives and negatives and some in between, but it isn't really representative of, for example, a screening population. So it requires a great amount of time, discipline, focus, make sure you're inclusive, and then find those partners who are willing to go on that journey with you to deploy in hospitals and, to start to evaluate, does the technology, does it perform in the way that you think it will, but also where can it add most value? And we've found some amazing things on that journey in terms of, we designed MIA as an independent reader. It has a CE mark to do that. But actually, we didn't predict that it would be so effective at picking up these extra cancers. And now we're rolling out to the NHS. Broadly, we're deploying to 15 hospitals now. It's live in Scotland. But I think there are some other considerations in terms of deploying in the real world, and those are governmental ones. So I think in the UK, there's a last mile piece that we need to solve. The way that AI solutions are approved, the regulatory environment here is still evolving, and finding the person who can actually approve the use of an AI solution in the NHS is how I spend most of my time. So that's the story.
Thank you. So if we have an AI that is intended for use in a really, obviously, important area to diagnose and pick up breast cancer, we have a national breast cancer screening program. We have a shortage of radiologists. We have high false positive and false negatives, which means that if an AI is too accurate, then it's great. But if it's also picking up things that aren't cancer, then the NHS, the already cash-strapped NHS, is spending time biopsying women, and I'm one of those that's had a false negative biopsy. So you essentially have a biopsy that is negative, and so you can have lots of those if an AI is just sort of picking up everything, has no specificity, or you can have an AI that has good sensitivity, like a lot of companies I see who have good results on paper. The question is, in the real world, once you deploy this in the NHS, will this hold? And essentially you then get the sensitivity dropping and you get lots of false negatives, which is women being told that they don't have cancer where they do. Of course, we have the governance whereby an AI will never be the only reader, where you always have human clinician oversight, and which may or may not be, and it's an argument, more work for the NHS and for healthcare services. But it's interesting to see that even when you build something that has a sensible intended use, it's not that easy to deploy. How about in cases where we want to deploy at large scale? So we all know that during the pandemic, for example, everything stopped. Routine procedures stopped. Clinical trials stopped, and anyone who's had a family member with cancer, for example, will know that sometimes clinical trials are your only source of treatment when you get to a certain stage in your cancer. So I think, Sarah, my question to you is around how do you take something that is useful, hopefully, and use this technology and scale it, especially in a time of need, in a pandemic, and if you can tell us what you do and how as we build these systems, we can scale for need and also for population size.
So I think picking up on Sarah's comments around about accessibility, my name's Alison, Holland, and I'm at Medable, and we're really looking at how do we improve the accessibility of choice for patients about how they're going to interact with clinicians at any point in their healthcare and life sciences cycle, and that we see clinical trials very much as a chapter of available healthcare option for patients. And as you say, in oncology and some of the areas of significant unmet need, that can be a really life-saving option or transformation option for those patients. We look at really taking a more consumer-style approach to how we put the patient at the centre of the healthcare and giving them choices about participation. We all know that no two patients are the same, both in terms of their disease state, but also in terms of their choices around technical competency, literacy, accessibility, and so on. So we're really looking at how do we standardise that, and as clinical trials and new medications are tested at a global level, making sure that we're scaling to say we're not meeting the needs of just one patient population or one demographic within one country, but looking at doing that consistently to get that high quality data for subsequent registration. And so looking at the on-ramps of how patients even know about clinical trials in the first place, which historically there has been a lack of trust and a lack of transparency around that and a lack of equality about accessibility, and then making it easier for people to have choices. That if you're able to choose to go to your bricks and mortar site and see your trusted clinician, that's brilliant. But some patients may choose to have the convenience of being in a different location. That might mean they prefer to go to a pharmacy. They might prefer to go to another location. They might prefer to stay at home. When we think about patients within an oncology clinical trial who maybe are feeling pretty poorly at some time points during that, and having those choices about being able to participate and keep that continuity going. So as we saw during the pandemic responses, we saw a huge increase in pushing out the number of digital solutions that were available to patients, both on mobile applications and web applications, sensors, other ways of collecting and managing that data. What we've seen since then is really a more standardized approach to saying, well, we tried a lot of things through there. What did we learn that actually worked? And then how do we make sure that we've got more consistency to that go forward? Also, when we apply things in that pandemic response, you apply them on top of standard practice. You apply them on top of protocol. What we're now seeing is getting upstream of designing a suite of digital endpoints that matter to patients and that matter to answering the hypothesis of the clinical and scientific question that we're trying to answer with the drug development program, and making sure those are standardized and used all the way through the program so that we can get to some of the return on investment outcomes that we want to get. We're starting to see evidence that that can return a 13x return on investment on the EMPV of a clinical trial in phase 3 by having this digital library and digital availability of core standards that can be applied all the way through the clinical trial program. So as we heard in one of the panels this morning, we're all frustrated with drug development cycle times taking 8 to 12 years, and that's probably on a good day. What we're looking at is how do we not just improve that incrementally, but we absolutely change the paradigm such that if we can change the paradigm of how long it takes to develop that body of evidence, where that body of evidence comes from, and the population representation of patients into that trial in the first place, then by the time it comes to market, we've reduced the time and the cost of that and hopefully made the affordability of those drugs actually easier for everyone as well.
Thank you. Lara. I guess I see a lot of companies who are building AI and they think they are going to change the healthcare system or improve outcomes, and a lot of them are not. My question to you, given your experience and innovation in healthcare systems, in clinical medicine, is what is mission critical? There's a huge buzz around AI, there's a lot of hype. We know that everything is slow to be implemented in healthcare systems. We know that ChatGPT-4 is not going to change healthcare. What is mission critical? What should we be investing in? What is important? Because we can't do everything, and we have to prioritize. And I guess my second question is, what would be your vision for this mission-critical AI? What is your vision of that, how we create a successful pathway for go-to-market for the companies, but also for implementation for the patients so that they see these hopefully improved outcomes because of the technology?
Yeah, good. Thank you for having me here. And as most of you will know, I'm a surgeon, I'm not a computer scientist, but my interest in AI goes back to 2015. Mark Walport was the professor of medicine, and that's the only way I could close the gap between the professor of surgery and the professor of medicine, was to look into AI. Let me just start with a few, how did I get involved in this? And that probably could answer your question. In 2015, one of our exceptionally smart PhD students, who was Dominic King, some of you may know here in this room, was a fellow of the NIHR Patient Safety Translation Research Center. And one of the areas we were looking at the time was how could we predict patients who are deteriorating? As you all know, 1 in 10 patients in a hospital deteriorates in hospital. They may have come in normal to have an operation. 1 in 10, 10%. And we had all the data sources to do that. And the whole idea was to bring a digital app that will actually, in fact, display the drivers of deterioration in a patient on a surgical ward, on a medical ward. And that ended up becoming a digital app called HARK. And then the stumbling block, we keep talking about the NHS, the wealth of data we have. We do have wealth of data, but none of this data is curated. Imperial College Trust had 37 different data sources, and none of them talk to each other. So the first challenge we had, if we were to implement this, we needed an API that actually could bring all of this together. Virtually impossible. Zero interest from the NHS Trust, but to be fair, they didn't have the money to do that. So we've ended up in this stumbling block, which the only way out is a partnership. And Google knocked our doors, and that would have been DeepMind in those days. And they've heard about all of what we were doing at the time. They were tinkering with this in the Royal Free, and they got into some data controversy. And they more or less acquired Hark, which was this startup company, very early on, which was painful, really, truly painful, of what it could have done or what the value of that would have been to our own organization. And then that became Streams, which was a digital application, but it also goes back to the naivety in which that was actual fact presented to the world, very naive, despite being a true partnership, with little regard about the concerns in data privacy and data sharing with industry. Anyhow, cut the story short, Streams then was developed further, but didn't really get anywhere when that Royal Free, because they combined the two together when there was a major case, as you know, at the time of infringing of data privacy laws. And but that was the starting point. And the sad fact in all of this is I lost Dominic King. He went to work for, and I lost another one of our very gifted lecturers. But they made something out of it. And at the end of the day, the collaboration did build, and we then got involved in the mammography project, as you probably will know. That led to the development of the AI mammography, which was published in Nature in 2020, and thanks to Sam Roberts, who might be here, who was the CEO of the Accelerated Access Collaborative, the implementation of that program went through the NHS, and that's been reasonably successful, as previous speaker, as Alison pointed out. The beauty of that is, how could we shift our reading from 2 radiologists to 1, and that's what we're looking at the moment, 1 plus AI. And there's no question it is better than the 2 readers. And in the US, they have 1 reader, but their sensitivity specificity is much lower than us. So these are, we might be sitting on wealth of data, but unless we invest and curate this data and encourage our own startups, we're always going to be in the mouth of the sharks out there. Not sharks, they were partners at the time, and that's the only way we're going to win the confidence of the public. In terms of where we wish to take this to. In another role, I chair a company called A Priori, and during COVID, the pandemic, the wealth of just cross the pond, what's happening there, the potential of AI in this little company in predicting every possible variant of COVID-19 virus, 10 to the power of 50, is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And again, the wealth of data we had here, in which we've sequenced 50% of the PCR positive tests. We had that information. We could have predicted where Omicron is coming or not. We could have predicted the son or daughter of Omicron. We're always behind in this, and we need to do something about this. And, whether we like it or not, we need to, not just to create an environment in the NHS that will attract industry, but how do we nurture the small startups that we don't end up with the very premature sale of these companies at a very little value.
Thank you. It's very interesting because Will mentioned something that really ties in with that, where he talked about use this case study, this company Ibex, pathology AI. It's a big area. There are competitors worldwide, some that are doing very well. One that was a spin out from Sloan Kettering. And of course, the business models in the US are very different to here, but also the healthcare systems are very different. And you talked about, or at least you alluded to the fact that while they've got technology that is validated, the go-to-market and implementation strategy is still it's still in flux. You don't know where your biggest return on investment is going to be, but most importantly, I think that ties in with where the biggest impact is going to be, because if it has impact, then the money comes, I presume. And so how do we, in an ideal world, how do you see us thinking about, even as we're building for an intended use that we know is important, diagnosing prostate cancer, diagnosing breast cancer, how do we, if we could plan the go-to-market as we build, how do you how would you envision that this would work so that you could have the highest impact as well as return on investment? I mean, clearly the problem is that it's hard to sell anything into anywhere, but what are the roadblocks for implementing useful, validated AI? What do you think are the biggest challenges?
For me, a lot of it comes down to risk appetite of the buyer. And for early stage venture-backed businesses, the number one metric other than accuracy of the algorithm is how many months of cash do they have. And so trying to identify, and it's a real compromise for those businesses of where is the largest potential deployment that we would like to sell to, and how does that overlay with the amount of, and it is measured in months or weeks, the months and weeks worth of cash we have to actually show progress. Because what that typically means is most of our early stage companies focus on potentially smaller implementations where the buyers or the stakeholders on the other side of the table have a far higher risk appetite. And that means starting off with smaller contract sizes. So Ibex was first selling into Unilabs and Medipath, like privately owned European pathology groups, where they're very much kind of risk on and are happy being an early adopter. Equally, the financial incentives for a lot of US customers for that business, whether that's like a Quest or a kind of veterans group or whatever, like that I would still say is a higher risk appetite than selling into maybe more kind of NHS groups within the UK. That said, I think Wales is now the only country in the world where if you have a prostate cancer diagnosis, it will, without fail, get an AI view as part of your diagnosis, which is Ibex's technology. It's quite random that Wales is the first geography to have full national uptake. But in that regard, it is a really critical conversation for any of the early stage companies, which really comes down to survival of making sure that you are selling to the most, I suppose, experimental or risk-on decision makers. And that, often from the outside, that's really hard to take a view on.
The early adopters, Mark, I saw Mark has his hand up.
Thank you very much. So regulation has the opportunity to both help and hinder you. So if you were going to set up the regulatory system, and it hasn't really settled yet, I think, on AI, what should it do to help you, and what should it not do that would hinder you?
I have an answer to that.
Yeah, of course.
I think we found the FDA.
Yes, speak now.
I found the FDA very good to work with in that we can literally pick up the phone and ask a question. So the number one thing I would ask for is the opportunity to have direct engagement with the bodies that are deciding what evidence we should be providing. And I also think the regulatory environment is quite fragmented here. So NICE is approving certain things under their medical device initiative, and then the NSC is approving other things, and it's a mess because nobody is actually able to make a decision. So that's one of the biggest risks. So having a clear authority and clear ability to engage would be transformative, I think, for this ecosystem.
The problem with this, Mark, is I don't think the regulators know how to deal with AI. Yeah. And I think that's a co-educational issue, which I think the only way you can achieve that is to work with industry and academia. Because there are very few examples in which you are working with a therapeutic agent that is learning as it goes. You can learn from the side effects of it, but not learn from the dosages and everything, because that's all based on your initial phase 3 trials. But AI needs a more flexible thinking. I think the FDA is well ahead of other regulators. Yeah. They started well before. But it's critical in enabling academia and industry to excel in this by having some view or some steer of what they wish to achieve in terms of the steps of regulatory approvals.
If I can come back on that, excuse me, I agree completely. And there was a phase when AI was treated as though it was a device. Well, of course, it's the exact opposite of a device, because every device, you know the parts list. AI is continually evolving. So I guess my question then is, should there be a pact between the regulator and the people that are producing the products, that there needs to be absolute ongoing transparency over the outcomes? because otherwise the AI can, in principle, go wild and go in the wrong direction.
Absolutely.
So the FDA have something, and they're the only ones that have this because the European regulators don't have. They have something called the change control protocol, where every time there's a change to either the intended use or the performance or the target population, you have to inform them. But that's the FDA, and just as Ara said, the FDA are ahead, and one of the problems within the European Commission, and now, of course, with the UKCA and everything being in lux and in limbo in the UK, is the lack of expertise. So I've done some work with the WHO where we built a framework for evidence generation, and they're saying, well, we don't know how to advise the member states. And the problem is nobody knows anything about AI. You know, Deus and I have had a quick chat, and he says, well, of course, we PQing pharma, and we should treat AI like pharma. It should have rigorous steps of validation. We should treat it like a drug. It can kill a patient. There should be response. But at the same time, it's not a drug. And so it's that understanding of the nuances and what we need to be looking at and how not to let the regulatory piece be a roadblock, and how to have some sort of harmonization. So the IMDRF was formed, and yet they have no real role in helping either the companies or the procurers. So again, it's, you know, outside of the regular, and you've got a CE mark. What is the biggest roadblock, Sarah, within the regulatory, the sort of pathway from regulatory to procurement?
It's this. We're being told 10 different things that, you know, from an evidentiary point of view, that the technology needs to be able to do, some of which are valid and some of which are completely invalid. But if you don't know who you can have that conversation with, and equally, you know, we think we've developed this deployment methodology which is safe, real-world evidence, which is the only way to prove the technology generalizes, and RCT isn't going to do that. It may be valuable to do at the side, but you're never going to know doing an RCT if it works, you know, if that's in Leeds, if it's going to work in Glasgow. So I think it's, you know, I think it is mission critical for the UK to address this soon. Otherwise, we're going to see a generation of AI companies killed.
Yeah.
I think it's
They're
that
already
dramatic.
dying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,
The transparency piece also cuts the other way, that it's also incumbent on those bringing AI to market to be able to expose and educate what the mechanics are. And so if I think with the digital pathology example I've mentioned a few times, when that business first came to market, the output would be a risk score. And pathologists found that really difficult to deal with. And trust in that approach was low, understandably. Whereas when the business actually found that by showing heat maps on top of the interface that pathologists would look at, and wouldn't just say, I think you've got it wrong, but you should look again in this particular area, it made it far easier both for clinicians, but ultimately the regulator to take a view on, okay, this is why the decision is being made, and I can validate that. Whereas I think as long as AI remains a black box where the only output is a score, I think it's far harder to take an ongoing view as well on, actually, is this something I could put my name to?
I mean, regulation also, if I could just say, I mean, look what's happened in Italy on,
yes.
you know, ChatGPT. They banned it because of privacy rules. So if you want to be difficult, that's what you're going to get. Yeah.
And Sarah, what are the biggest roadblocks to going to market for you been in Medable?
For us, it's really about global data harmonization. And really looking to that source of data and consistent data standards and data accessibility around the world, that you can harmonize those different sources together.
Yeah. And of course, the AI is only as good as the data it's trained on and tested on, and how, I mean, I think that's a different panel, just talking about data in itself and data governance and how we improve the data.
Can I just kill one thing, which is if anyone's thinking about pulling together a test data set, it's a waste of time. There are so many people working on this,
Yeah.
and it's so nuanced depending on the intended use, and as to your point, the data. It's a...
So I guess, Ara, how does the government deal with this? We have the biggest data source in the world. It's a mess. It's how do we start investing? And before talking about the AI and the impact it could have, how can we solve the number one problem, which is the data?
We do have a lot of data.
A lot.
But what is the data worth? Not much. I mean, let's just go back to radiology. We do have hundreds of thousands of mammograms, but they're worthless. Unless we're going to change practice, I still do not know why a radiology looks at an image, has an analog dictaphone, records the report goes to the PA signs it, radiologists come back to check it, rubber stamp it, and give it away. When in actual fact, the radiologist should be sitting on that image, annotating it, and having a digital signature on all the areas where the abnormalities are, with a report that is integrated in that digital image. Absolutely. That is where we should be. That is what we should tell the radiologist. You won't be paid unless you do it this way. Then you have an asset. You have a value-creating asset there, whether it's for future AI research or discovery.
Someone's clapping.
Or make that data available to humanity everywhere in the world. Yeah. Otherwise, it's complete. We think we're sitting on a very wealthy. It's not.
Just to give the panel members some hope. Thank you. Yeah, just to give you panel members some hope, we're very proudly the awardee for the Prix Galien for Best Digital Health last year. Thank you, Sir Mark, for the great honour. Our solution, my name's Simon Russellingham, I'm the CEO of Behold.ai. Our AI technology, which basically as a person presents for a chest x-ray, will tell you two things. One, within 9 seconds, it will tell you to a very high degree of confidence with an automated report, Darzi, fully into the system in 9 seconds, that you're normal, or actually there's suspected lung cancer here. And to your point, I've met Peter at Kheiron. He's a fantastic chap. We are rolling out. 11% of NHS trusts are actually deploying our technology, and we're very happy to be a nominee again. I think the thing is, there is excellent examples of AI, but you just don't hear about them. You won't hear about us because we're busy deploying. So one of the things I would like to sort of mention and sort of challenge the panel is that our technology is a piece of software. And one of the biggest barriers is the assumption that it is a drug. And we have to go through all the rigmarole of a drug. We sell our technology for 50 grand a pop, not £1 billion worth of revenue. So there's got to be a general sort of view from, and this is the challenge back to the panel, that I think we've overhyped it a lot, but we need to get the proportionality associated with this technology. I just wanted your views on that.
Yes, and you made the point, and fantastic you have that. What I was making sure is how do we improve the quality of our data to help you, rather than the other way around. And I take your point, absolutely. And fantastic you're coming in because you're displacing behaviors rather than improving them, which also probably that threat will lead people to think through how could they improve the value of the data in front of them.
Is there any way that we could, Will talked about, startups that are actually building good AI that could impact patient outcomes, running out of money, the finite resources. How do we think about partnerships, new models of funding? OpenAI started as a non-profit and then it became, it built and then now it's not. I was thinking of one of the competitors of IBEX. This is another AI in pathology, Path AI, who've now partnered with Roche. And this idea that you could get really big companies, the Roches, the Googles, if it works, and Roche essentially have a platform to support their research. They have companion diagnostics, and so this is a form of go-to-market strategy, but also being able to invest in them so that they can get good quality data, so they can continue to build their models and then deploy using Roche's UPath system. I guess my question to all the panelists is, from your viewpoint and from what you do, what is the ideal form of a startup private partnership in order to solve these problems of 1, data, 2, building good quality AI, 3, deployment into both private and public healthcare systems? I'll start from this end and work.
Yeah, certainly I think it starts with the relevance to the outcome to the patient. And so looking at who are the appropriate partners then who are wrapped around and invested in that outcome to the patient. Certainly from our perspective, that was working with pharma. And looking at different pharma partners who we could align with around therapeutic treatment pathways, to really look at the improvements that we wanted to make in digital understanding and real-time access to data in order to not only allow clinicians to make real-time decisions when the patient wasn't necessarily in front of them with reliable data, but also to be able to use some of that data then for more predictive analytics and future state digital biomarkers, software as a medical device, and companion diagnostics. So really looking at what that future pathway was and what the ultimate outcome would be. That might be patients being able to be at home more when they're going through their CAR-T therapies, but having a digital biomarker that was monitoring them for potential cytokine storm or ILD or other indications at that time that you might pick up predictively and be able to allow the patient more time at home in the comfort with their family.
Okay, so future role for pharma. Sarah?
Yeah, well, I think we're at a very interesting point in terms of Kheiron's journey. I think we're trying very hard not to get gobbled up by one of the global giants, which is, of course, the fate of so many UK companies. So we'd prefer not for that to be our fate. But at the same time, we really do need to scale up. We have this amazing technology. We hear every week about the women whose cancers were detected earlier by Mia. And we want to be able to scale that up as quickly as possible. So we're thinking of strategics in terms of how do we scale impact. And for me in particular, how do we scale impact in the developing world, where there are limited breast screening programs and doctors available.
Well, partnerships.
Partnerships can be transformative, but for me the question is normally when is that the best route for scale? In the early on, when you're trying to refine the product and end user feedback and figure out exactly where you should position yourself. Like distributing through a partner puts more distance between you and the end user, and when you're trying to learn as fast as possible, that can be unhelpful. But I do think once businesses have refined that, a partnership model to drive go-to-market makes a lot of sense. But I do think AI and algorithm businesses are quite unique in that from the buyer's perspective, that there's a risk of people being sold an algorithm for this, an algorithm for this, and an algorithm for that. And on the others, for the businesses developing these technologies, one of the biggest challenges is what is their go-to-market for a very narrow, specific use case. And this is where I think in today's fundraising environment, where lots of companies are finding it very hard, we will see a period of consolidation where the large partners who already have the distribution will increasingly be building their own algorithm libraries and collections to put through their existing channels. And so seeing like Zebra, which is one of the larger players within the radiology space, being acquired, I think we will see more and more of this. And it's a big challenge for the smaller companies to either build their product and AI suites broad enough so it's not just an AI algorithm for a very particular modality, but actually the parallel I suppose would be in like the security software industry, where actually now buyers buy a broad range of software functions and features that covers all of their risk, versus maybe 3 or 4 years ago they would have different businesses doing different things. So I think vendor fatigue, especially in this space, will drive more consolidation.
All right, partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, the partnerships need to be a true, partnership of equal. Until such stage, you will get into that level of trust and a partnership of equal. This will not really work. Just go back to the mammography, what we've learned from that. What we've learned from that, actual fact, if you look at the serial mammograms, which is where the learning happened, we picked up mammograms which were reported as normal prior to the one which is reported abnormal, in which there were real changes which will suggest that in those days it wouldn't have been classified by a radiologist as abnormal. What's the biggest challenge facing health systems? If you keep that in your mind, what's the big challenge? Is we have an unsustainable health systems globally. Growth 2% above GDP. The US, look what they're spending. A complete basket case. Look what we're spending. Completely unaffordable. We need disruption. And the only way we're going to disrupt this is to detect disease earlier. It's what our goal. We need to preempt disease. This world is full of people who are disease positive but symptom negative. And the only way we're going to figure them out is not by symptomatology, going and seeing a GP, I have a cough and I have this and that, or a routine mammography screening. It is about proactively screening and preempting disease with biomarkers. It has to be. That's the only way. I mean, take the example of liquid biopsy. That could transform and shift the needle to the left of early diagnosis of cancer. It's not going to be colonoscopies. It's not going to be mammographies. That is the future we're looking at. We could do the same with rheumatoid arthritis. We could do the same in dementia. That is coming, and that's the role of AI. We need true partnership with industry to grow this, because it's going to help us. It's going to reduce the expenditure on health in the future. That's the world I see, but to do that, you really need to have the mutual trust and partnership.
I think that's a wonderful place to take some final questions from the audience. Mel?
Hi there. Yeah, I'd like to come back to something Dave said earlier about low and middle income markets and the complete absence, for example, of radiologists who are expert in identifying TB, I think was the example that he used. What's the opportunity here? Is there a much bigger opportunity in some of those markets where you're actually providing something that isn't there versus just trying to augment something that is there? Can the panelists comment on that, please?
Something that we're looking at. I think that the challenge is making sure that if there isn't something there, there's at least a way to take care of people if you do identify, for example, if they have cancer. So we're looking into where we go in our first developing country, but we need to make sure that if we do identify cancers earlier, that there are people who then can treat those people. So I think that's what we're thinking about.
I completely support that. As long as some of the ethical issues of not exploiting lower and middle-income countries in generating these algorithms are addressed, because otherwise it will be a major scandal, and we've seen that before.
Yep. And I think these are the questions that the WHO is slowly trying to answer. And I've been there and looking at cancer, cervical cancer, which is the biggest killer of women, and really thinking about who's building what data are they using, is it generalizable, and how can we advise member states, how can we make sure that these people aren't coming in to take the data from the population and then trying to sell back something to them that they can't actually afford. And so there is a lot of ethics, and I think one of the first documents that came out of the WHO and AI was actually on the ethics of AI and implementation, and so that's a huge area, Mark.
I want to come to Will's point, because I think it's quite important to look at this through the eyes of the purchaser. And although radiologists and histopathologists get a lot of bashing, at least they were trained that they would actually look at all X-rays and they would look at all tissues. Now, they weren't perfect, and we needed specialists. But in some sense, I think it's extremely difficult to be in a world where you want to diagnose breast cancer, you go to one AI. You want to diagnose prostate, you go to another one. That's not, and so there's got to be some way of aggregating them. And the obvious people to aggregate them are actually the people that make the X-ray machines, and of course that's what they developed in rather proprietary ways, which made data sharing quite problematic, I think. And so there needs to be something there. But I think it is quite important to look through the eyes of a confused purchaser, because there are now just so many offers. How do you decide which ones to go for? And particularly, as you rightly point out, that the real world is the only place to try these. And so you've got to make some choices and then be able to explore how they develop in the real world. And so it seems to me that we've got a very immature market at the moment. In a mature market, I can't help feeling there's going to be, a Google and a Microsoft. They may not be called that, but that's what they will be, because they will, at the end of the day, you want one system that will interpret your X-rays and preferably all the other things and write the note. And I think another area of AI we haven't talked about is the AI in the room. In other words, it's sitting in the clinic between Aaron and his patients. It actually dictates the letter for him, writes the note, integrates all the tests, sends the patient to the right place, and does all the communication. That's the future, I think. And how do we get there?
I think there's one really key question that you have to ask if you're considering using any AI, and I think it's the great differentiator, which is once you've sort of got a baseline performance, is how are you monitoring your technology? Because most people don't even have a clue. So I think that's really where you start to understand whether a technology is fit for even a real-world evaluation, because the vast majority of companies don't even have anything in place to understand threshold shifts and how the model shifts over time, and it does. It shifts if machines change. It shifts in all kinds of circumstances if you use a mammography van. So I think that's a really key question that I think people need to keep in mind when they're assessing, as you said, a plethora of offerings.
Sorry, Iris.
No, I just think history will tell us, Mark, that all of these disruptive innovations happen in a fragmented way, and then will be a system integration that comes with it. The thing that concerns me most about AI and moving forward is the cyber side and how we're going to protect that, because it's constantly learning, and how you're going to ensure that we don't place, at some stage, someone has to validate the systems on a regular basis. And that's an issue which cyber AI itself is an extremely dangerous place, and there are already systems around the world dealing with that as we speak in different war zones.
And presumably this generative medical AI that sits between the doctor and the patient needs to be monitored. How are we going to monitor a system that is being used in real time? And I mean, it sounds...
It's got to monitor against outcomes continuously. Any way to do it.
Which sounds expensive.
What I do think is interesting of trying to draw commonalities in the pockets where adoption has been strongest, and it's typically in areas that are data rich. I was having a conversation with someone over coffee earlier today around actually like oncologists in many ways are leading the way. Maybe also linked with the fact that many diagnoses are terminal, and therefore the risk appetite for users is higher, and there's greater openness for experimentation. But I do think many of the areas where the application of AI will be felt most strongly are in very unglamorous and non-sexy parts of health, of actually identifying, looking at this patient and previous EHR kind of digital phenotyping. These are the people that are most these are the people that are most likely to not turn up to their appointment. Yeah. And actually across a whole health system, if you can move that needle by 0.5%, arguably the efficiencies you will generate will be far greater than increasing kind of prostate cancer diagnosis rates, and actually starting from a very kind of operational view of what is the most lucrative and effective application at a systems level versus maybe the more sexy, buzzwordy areas, which I think entrepreneurs are gradually clocking onto.
Yeah. Final question.
Yes. Yes, hello, thank you. My name is Anthony Viscogliosi, and I come from the States. So this is a very interesting discussion that we're participating in today about the use of digital health and AI and its application here in the UK. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of a medical device-focused CRO. And we've specialized in digital healthcare and AI, particularly with more than 100 clients in the US market. The FDA can be an enemy or can be a partner. How do each of you view the FDA in terms of being a foreign-based, an outside US-based business addressing one of the largest healthcare markets in the world the United States? Is the FDA friend or foe? And how do you use the FDA to access the market in the United States?
I think the FDA has been both a friend and a foe over the years, and it depends. What's interesting to tell you is that there are many US companies coming here to seek approval of their products through MHRA, which may answer your question. It's good for us because they're setting up shop here, but that's an issue in recent times. The FDA is not really opening its door to its own market, let alone British companies. That's been my experience.
We've had a great experience in that we can pick up the phone, someone will talk to us and tell us, and we say, we think this evidence is suitable for this particular application. What do you think? And we can actually have a conversation. I would love to have that conversation in the UK.
One thing that's positive is the breakthrough designation
Yeah.
channel, which I think has benefited a lot of companies I work with, albeit the main question there is how does breakthrough designation then translate into reimbursement codes? So the headlines are positive, but some of the more mechanical and secondary considerations are arguably quite complex.
AI and medical software that involves addressing a patient specifically, not necessarily electronic health records, are considered medical devices at the FDA.
Yeah.
And so, do you find that view helpful to creating value for the businesses that you are creating?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Yeah, so the fact that the FDA regulates certain AI, as a medical device, do you find that activity of regulation helpful to creating value for the businesses you are investing in? Do you understand that?
Yeah, I think it's very helpful. So I work with companies who are trying to get regulatory approval, and it is a helpful framework. I think from the sort of overall vision point of view, what I find most helpful about the FDA and the way they deal with software as a medical device, which is how they see AI, is that it's a good filter for companies that are building things that I'm absolutely certain will have zero effect on patient outcomes, or maybe even have negative outcomes. So I think the FDA system, and again, as Ara said, they've been around for longer, and they have positives and negatives, but overall, I think if you're very unclear about what you're building and you are trying to cut corners in validation, I think the FDA soon shows you that it's impossible to cut corners. So that's a positive. I think that's it. I think that's a wrap. Thank you to my wonderful panelists.